afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Emmel, and I'm a land ecologist for Pennsylvania's Department of Natural Resources. Today I'll be talking about bat populations in Pennsylvania and how I propose we create a preserve for their conservation. Pennsylvania is home to 9 different bat species. 6 of these hibernate here, and 3 migrate south for the winter. Some of these hibernating bats include the little brown bat, northern long-eared bat, and the Indiana bat as pictured here. All bats in Pennsylvania are insectivores, preying on insects that fly over bodies of water or catching them off the leaves of plants. Bats consume 20% of their body weight in insects in a single feeding, with the smallest bat consuming nearly 1 million insects a year. Bats reproduce in late summer to early fall, often only producing a single young a year. Bats roost during the day and reserve hunting until late afternoon, night, and early morning. If they are seen during the day, it is often from heat or roost disturbance. Bats hibernate or migrate in the winter months, going into torpor to reduce the burning of their fat reserves. Their typical hibernacula include caves, buildings, rock crevices, and trees. Bat populations are currently under threat by habitat loss, fragmentation, and the invasive Pseudogymnoascus destructanus, or better known as PD, which causes a fungal disease called white nose syndrome. PD affects the skin of the bats and disturbs their hibernation during cold months. Since bats are insectivores, they rely on their fat reserves to get them through hibernation, and when they are awoken from hibernation, they lose their fat reserves since prey is scarce, leading to dehydration, starvation, and sometimes even death. As vital hibernaculum like caves become infested with PD, it makes land that was once safe and has vital resources unviable. While these areas are still used by bat species for hibernation, it is leading to a decrease in the species' fitness overall, and even death. Another of the major threats to bat populations is habitat loss and fragmentation. Deforestation is leading to habitat loss and fragmentation for many bat species. Bats use trees to roost in during the warmer months, and some even use them as a form of hibernacula in the winter months. Urbanized expansion can also affect bat species, where key natural habitat is often destroyed for development. Chemical and physical pollution from urbanization also affects bat species. Edge effects from habitat fragmentation also reduce species fitness near the edges, negatively affecting roosting and foraging behavior. Setting aside land to address the threats of white nose syndrome and habitat loss and fragmentation is important for the survival of the species. These threats are resulting in a decline of over 90% of bat populations in the state, mostly due to disturbance in their hibernation. An area where bats can remain undisturbed in their hibernation and roosting can be extremely beneficial to the species, reducing any fitness restraints they are currently experiencing. These disturbances are human-induced and include artificial lighting, high-traffic areas, loud sounds, logging, and other activities that could disturb their populations. The issues of white nose syndrome can also be addressed in a preserve design by creating and optimizing areas where PD cannot thrive in. To create a preserve for the conservation of bat species in Pennsylvania, I have addressed 3 research questions. 1. How do abiotic factors affect the prevalence of white nose syndrome in bat hibernacula? The abiotic factors in bat hibernacula can create suitable conditions for PD to thrive in, leading to an increase in the prevalence of white nose syndrome in bats during hibernation. Figuring out what conditions increase PD in these hibernating areas is important because it can give insight into alterations we can make to a preserve for bat species. If bats are still able to hibernate in their normal hibernacula, with a slightly altered to be unfavorable for PD, it can mean the difference in extinction and survival of the species. 2. What type of land and biotic needs do bats utilize for hibernation? The land bats use for hibernation is important for their conservation because it can help us to understand favorable conditions they need and where they may be found. Creating a preserve where bats can hibernate without the threat of white nose syndrome is extremely important for creating a preserve. From my previous research, I have found that bats use a wide variety of areas for hibernation like caves, rock crevices, attics, inside trees, mines, and other areas with ideal temperatures and humidity. By looking at areas where bats naturally hibernate, we can begin to compare to areas where PD is often found. And 3. How much hibernacula is needed to support the population of bat species? Looking at how much area is needed to support the hibernating bat species in the state is important because it lets us know how much we need to protect. If we must close off areas that are infected with PD, we must make sure the species still has enough area to hibernate, and if it doesn't, we can look to other artificial options. This can also be an important factor in trying to protect forest populations, since another impact on bat species is deforestation. This can help to protect their current habitat and also continue to develop their habitat to be more suitable for their survival. To address the abiotic factors that are best suitable for bat hibernacula, we have to look at what is best suitable for the bat's survival, while also looking at what is unsuitable for the PD survival. In a study done by Frick et al. In 2022, they found that humidity did not show any trends on the growth of PD, but lower temperatures favored the bat's survival. This showed that humidity wasn't a big abiotic factor leading to white nose syndrome, but lower temperatures were something we had to address. This got me thinking about how we can keep lower temperatures in hibernacula, and from doing a little bit more research, I think I found some answers. After studying tricolor bats for 3 years after the introduction of white nose syndrome, Loeb and Winters found that bats began hibernating in the mouths of caves instead of the back. Their numbers were beginning to level out, and did not see as much as a decline anymore. A study done by Aaron et al. Found something similar. Bats were having a higher survival rate when seen hibernating in dead and alive trees. What do both of these studies have in common? Both populations had a higher survival rate when hibernating in shallower hibernacula, where temperatures will be lower to reduce or prevent the growth of PD. To know where and what we need to create a preserve for bats to thrive in is also very important. I interviewed with the supervisor at Mercer County Wildlife Center for some insight on this, since she has worked with and studied our native populations, including bats, for decades. One important thing she said to me was that bats being insectivores, you would think that protecting the insects would be important. Well, this is also important. Bats are not very picky either when it comes to picking their next meal. The main thing we need to focus on is protecting our forests, specifically protecting our native maple and oak trees that bats utilize for roosting and hibernation. These trees are essential to endangered bats like the little brown bat. Curta et al. Also studied bats in hibernacula that occurred at higher latitudes than normal, upwards of 670 feet. They found that bats that hibernate at high elevations were less likely to contract white nose syndrome, and their populations had a higher survival rate. Hibernating bats do not need food to survive, since they go into the torpor state to lower the consumption of their fat reserves. Instead, the main component of biotic needs that bats utilize is access to water, which Vanderwolf et al. Found to be necessary for their survival during hibernations. Bats do wake up periodically during hibernation to drink water, and their access can mean the difference of life and death for them. Now, how much area is needed to support populations of bat species in our preserve? With the exact number of bat species in Pennsylvania being unknown, it is hard to say exactly how much area they need. But with bats historically hibernating in colonies of 1,000 to 10,000, the availability of hibernacula is most important in determining this. By providing a high density of hibernacula in multiple connecting patches, we can provide for a number of bat species during their roosting and hibernating months. With white nose syndrome becoming more prevalent, bats are also seen hibernating in smaller colonies or individually. Dewan et al. Studied this and found that this is likely an adaptation the species has done in direct correlation of PD, since PD was less prevalent in smaller numbers and in colder temperatures with hibernacula like trees and rock crevices. Taking what we now know about the needs of bats, how do we incorporate this into our preserve design? With temperatures being a huge factor in the prevalence of PD, providing alternative hibernacula in the form of rock crevices on talus slopes and trees will be important. Talus slopes provide an elevated rock formation that allows for lower temperatures, and the higher elevation can also address PD not being able to survive at higher elevations. Having a preserve with native trees like oak and maple will also act as a form of hibernacula, while also allowing for higher elevation from PD, as well as any traffic that may pass by to prevent car collisions for flying bats. The lower levels to forested areas provide home for insects that bats feed on. Having access to water by creating a preserve around a large body of water will be essential to not only their survival, but also allow easy access to hunting grounds of insects. Since we do not know the exact population number we will be providing for, providing a high density of hibernacula and roosting sites is essential. This will include the density of trees and talus slopes at multiple patches with connecting corridors. As populations are beginning to adapt to hibernating in smaller numbers due to white nose syndrome, the accessibility of caves is not as important. Caves have a high prevalence of PD, making them more detrimental to the species than beneficial. Caves will not be as essential part of our preserve design because of this, and if any caves are present on the preserve, bats will be limited to the mouth of the cave in the form of wildlife-friendly fencing. Other human disturbances will be addressed by dimming any artificial lighting, implementing traffic calming, and noise reduction requirements. This is a map of the area that bat species have confirmed ranges in Pennsylvania. The solid lines represent areas where bats spend their summer months roosting. The diagonal lines represent areas where bats only overwinter in hibernacula, and the perpendicular lines represent areas where they roost in the summer months and also overwinter in hibernacula. The area circled in red represents Armstrong County, an area that bats use for both summer roosting and overwintering in hibernacula. Armstrong County is 664 square miles and has a small population of only about 65,000 people, and 60% of the landscape consists of forest land. Armstrong County also has a high to moderate amount of talus slopes as compared to the rest of the state, providing a high number of hibernacula for bats. Here I create a horizontal draft of my reserve. I created 3 large core reserves or nodes, which allows for larger populations of bats and decreases the competition for resources between bat species. With our main focus being on protecting from white nose syndrome, larger population sizes can also mean the difference between bat extinction and survival. I also create multiple linking corridors between the nodes in close proximity to one another, which allows for alternative routes between the nodes. With agricultural land, urbanization, and industrialization affecting bat populations, it is very important that they receive safe passage between the large reserve patches described before. With bats being active at night, the close proximity can allow bats to easily move between patches and control insect populations. This can also allow for a more diverse genetic population, and if one patch fails, the populations can move to other patches. The corridors I created are big enough to connect the core reserves, decreasing the edge effects between them, but also not being too big where they will spend too much time there. I also thought about what other landscapes will take place in my preserve. The core reserves will consist of forested area, while allowing for hibernacula areas and roosting. The lake and pasture area will allow for easy hunting grounds for the bats between each node, while the area between the corridors will likely be urban or farmlands. Each area also has a buffer zone, which accounts for edge effects around the nodes and corridors. I also thought about the vertical landscape of my preserve at each core node. Since bats use trees for roosting during the day, the canopy and understory are very important to maintain. The lower levels are important for their insect food sources like moths, mosquitoes, beetles, crickets, etc. Without these lower level plant communities, the food sources of bats would have nothing to feed on themselves, and should be maintained with them in mind. Also, keeping native plants for the area can help maintain the forest, protecting it from invasive plants and insects, diseases, and helps to conserve water resources. The talus slopes at each node, as well as the trees, will act as alternative hibernacula for the bats on the preserve. The pond and open area relate back to my horizontal landscape, with a large lake and pasture drawn there. I made sure to still provide smaller paths throughout the preserve, allowing researchers and visitors maneuverability between the landscape. Since Armstrong County has a low and sparse population, as seen with the pictures on the right, citizens will not be very affected by this preserve design. Any citizen of the county that does have land near the preserve will experience the effects of light dimming for streetlights, a noise reduction policy, and lower traffic speeds on roads. While people will not be prevented from entering the preserve, they must abide by the regulations we create to ensure the bat's safety. This means staying off paths as well as previous regulations I mentioned. Looking at my preserve in the future, the threat of invasive species is possible. We hope to limit and prevent this from happening by ensuring our native populations are provided with their required habitat factors. With the area being protected after the creation of the preserve, habitat loss on the preserve itself should not be an issue as long as we continue to have it protected. Climate change could be a huge detrimental factor for the preserve in the future, bringing on a reduction in native species when abiotic factors change, increasing temperatures in alternative hibernacula, making PD able to thrive there, and even shifting migration and hibernation patterns away from the preserve. There is no way to know exactly what is going to happen with climate change on the rise, and the only way for us to prepare will be to continually monitor and manage the landscape to ensure that it is meeting all the requirements of the species and that bat populations are remaining stable or increasing. Thank you, guys.